Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask our guests in-house if you'll be so kind to see that cell phones have been silenced as we prepare to begin as a courtesy to our presenters. And, of course, our Internet viewers are welcome at any time to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our panel today is Justin Johnson, who serves as Senior Policy Analyst for Defense Budgeting Policy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He has over a decade of experience on Capitol Hill in defense and foreign policy issues. Immediately prior to joining us here, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Military Legislative Assistant for Representative Doug Lamborn, a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee. He has also received his master's degree from the Naval War College. Please join me in welcoming Justin Johnson. Justin?
Thank you, John. Well, thank you for being here, particularly on another gorgeous December day in Washington. It's an honor to have three very fine and smart individuals join me here on the panel. That will hopefully just be an interesting conversation. No agendas, nothing beyond just kind of talking about some of the changes that we're seeing that they're experiencing in kind of the national security media environment. I'll introduce all three of them, and then we'll just go into some discussion for a few minutes, 20, 30 minutes maybe, and then open it up for Q&A from the audience. So go from there. To my immediate left is Ryan Evans. He is a widely published commentator, recovering academic. He deployed to Helmand Province in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011 as a social scientist on a U.S. Army human terrain team that was OPCON take-on to the Brits. He worked at the Center for National Interest, the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence in London. He's a fellow of the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society, received his MA from King's College London, and is on Twitter at EvansRyan202. Next to him is Ben Watson. Ben is the news editor for Defense One and the primary author of Defense One's morning email, The Debrief, which I highly recommend. He previously worked for NPR's All Things Considered and Here Now, just over here on North Capitol Street. Ben served for 5 years in the U.S. Army, where he was an award-winning combat cameraman and media advisor for Southern Afghanistan's Special Operations Command during 2010-2011 surge. Ben's on Twitter at @NatSecWatson. Next to him is Eli Lake, a Bloomberg View columnist who writes about politics and foreign affairs. He was previously the senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. He's also covered these issues for the Washington Times, the New York Sun, and UPI, contributing editor of the New York Republic. He's lived in Cairo as a correspondent for the New York Sun. He's traveled to at least Sudan, Iraq, and Gaza. And this is a great stat. It's in his bio. Lake is one of the few journalists to report from all three members of George Bush's axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And you can find Eli on Twitter at Eli Lake. So with the introductions done, I think perhaps just a general starting question would be, how have each of you seen kind of media coverage of national security, foreign policy, things like war, conflict, change in the last 5 or 10 years? You've each experienced this from different seats, different places. So maybe just start there and then dive into some more of the detailed questions as we go on. So maybe go Ryan and go down the panel. What have you seen change? Or perhaps what's the most significant changes, most important changes you've seen in the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, I guess I'll just say two things. I mean, one, I'm not a journalist, but War on the Rocks, we're in media and we are close observers of journalists, like two guys I'm on the panel with right here. And one thing I've noticed in war reporting particularly is there's been a generational change in that you still have a lot of the people that have been doing this for a while, like Eli and Greg Jaffe and Kim Dozier and a few other people out there. But you also have a lot of people that have actually served in Iraq or Afghanistan in the military or worked in the government that have become journalists. And actually Ben's a good example of that. I didn't know that Ben's an Army veteran and served in Afghanistan and probably other places too. And T.M. Gibbons Neff is another great example at the Washington Post, who are reporting on these issues through the prism of their personal experiences of being in the military, which I think is a really wonderful thing. And the second issue is because we have all these experienced people, they've been able to contribute to the sort of media discussion on war and foreign policy, not just through journalism, but through things like what War on the Rocks does, which I started which is commentary debate, not necessarily reporting, where we have all these different media spaces, and not just War on the Rocks. Defense One also publishes a lot of great commentary where people that have experience in war and foreign policy can be heard by a broader audience. And that's indicative of larger changes in media beyond defense. And so I think this is like a really exciting time for media and to be writing about these issues.
Well, I agree with everything that Ryan said. He said that it's exciting, and it is, but I think more importantly, maybe than that, is it is also historically dangerous for journalists to report these days from a war zone. And probably one of the most significant changes that I witnessed near the last few months of my time in Kandahar was a steep drop-off in embedded journalists. And this was because of the war in Libya. That had really shifted, I guess, the sort of eye of Sauron for the media. It went from Afghanistan over to a whole other conflict, and it really never even kind of came back to Afghanistan. Meantime, embeds, I think we had, in the South, there were about 120 or so in like July of 2010. And then it was about 13 or 14, like a couple weeks later. It was ridiculous. The surge was happening, there were a lot of things occurring, but the main sort of fundamental shift over there was, and over the years that followed, was the increasing sort of line that the Afghans were in the lead. And as the Afghans took the lead, the U.S. took the messaging, they kind of dropped it back. And I would try to reach out to some people after I'd gotten out of the Army to try to get some information on what's going on over there. And I was often kind of like, it's not our, we're not, you need to go to the Afghans for this, for a rather a lot of things. And it was getting a little frustrating to me because I was kind of like, I'm not here to shoot anyone in the foot. I'm just asking some questions. But no, it's the Afghans. So I think it was kind of the U.S. withdrawal from messaging and a lack of embeds, and of course ISIS putting a target on all these kidnapped journalists wherever they could find them. And I think those are some pretty significant trends that had occurred, to say nothing about Twitter in that time space as well. So.
When I think about this question, I think about, right after 9/11, Al-Qaeda had a means of communicating publicly. It was largely through videotapes to Al Jazeera. And in this period, as social media kind of forms and becomes prevalent, what we see is today, that I think it was very difficult to get what the enemy was sort of saying in a regular sense and judging that. And now there's such an explosion of jihadist media that it's very easy to analyze and discern and even have a record of statements of the groups that America's at war with. And it's created a cottage industry of people who analyze their media. It's not to say that I'm not under any illusions. I don't think it's the equivalent of journalism from the Washington Post or Bloomberg, where I work. But I think it's a measure that has changed the dynamics of things. And because it's instant, you can see in real time, if you know what Twitter accounts to follow, you can see what the Islamic State is saying about a battle that you're hearing about from the Pentagon. And I think it just makes it possible to get that side of it. And it also creates, I'd say, a problem, if I could say sort of provocation, which is what is it appropriate for a Western reporter in terms of their relationship with, say, a media person from a jihadist terror group. And we saw this about a year or so ago when James Comey wrote a letter to the New York Times scolding them for, I forget exactly what it was, but it was something about one of the AQAP spokespeople. But we see this, I think it becomes this issue, which is, these are groups that violate in every sense of the word, not just every law of war, but every kind of, the entire international system as we know it. So, and yet they use the same technology as the rest of us. So evaluating their messages, understanding it, but it does change the nature of how we cover it, I think. I think there's no doubt about that.
So Eli, just to pick up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, you and Josh wrote Josh Rogan wrote a story about Iraqi resistance to U.S. ground troops. As
Yes.
far as I could tell from the story, you guys reported not from Iraq. And what's interesting to me is how much information you guys and reporters in general are able to collect, not necessarily being on the ground, thanks to email, social media, internet things. How does that change your ability, your ability to cover these stories? What's the pro and what's the con of reporting at distance? Safety obviously is a big pro, but
Well, I was in Iraq earlier this year, and you try to go to continue to nurture your relationships with people so they answer your emails and phone calls in times like that. Josh and I are Washington-based reporters, so we have more sources in Washington, but you can get a lot of information out of Washington because there are so many people who have to cover these regions closely and diplomats who have to deal with these, and you can sort of cross-check it and stuff like that. But there is no substitute for spending time in the places that you cover, which is why I try to do that, in my reporting. And I think all the national security journalists who cover this, at least most of them, try to kind of get into that space. I do think that that you don't get the full picture if you're just kind of if all you're doing is embedding with the U.S. military. That's a valuable perspective, and it's important, and it should inform but it doesn't give you the entire perspective, because I think what we're interested in is how decisions are made at the very highest levels, and kind of all the information that goes into making those decisions, and getting that on the ground experience is important, but it's not sufficient.
Can I pick that up? I mean, I do think that, I agree with everything Eli said. I still think, obviously on-the-ground reporting is still important, but the wars that are going on now, it's much harder to do than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, whereas you had this really extensive infrastructure for embedding, because we had these bases that were there for a long time, and there were these known processes for journalists. And in Syria, obviously, it's a lot harder for Western journalists to cover on the ground. A couple who have unfortunately been executed by the Islamic State. And I don't think that media organizations have quite sorted through how they handle stringers in that kind of environment, because they're used to a much different kind of reporting environment. I think there's a lot of ethical questions. I mean, those executions, what was it, 2 summers ago, definitely accelerated the timeline of U.S. intervention in Syria, U.S. airstrikes anyway, in Syria, and boosting the Iraqi security forces. So media actors are not just reporting what's going on, they're actually having a major influence on events through risks that they're taking on themselves. And I think that's something that does not get discussed enough.
I might add one thing that I kind of I ran into, I think it was last week, with Colonel Warren. I was interacting with him, Army Colonel Warren, spokesman for the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. He was holding a briefing and talked about how there was only, I think he said that there was only one Iraqi casualty in the offensive against Ramadi, to clear Ramadi at that time. This was, I think, Thursday morning. As he said that, a tweet had rolled up from Al Jazeera saying 27 had died from 2 suicide car bombs during the Ramadi offensive. And so I'd reached out to, I think I actually just, I flagged Steve in that tweet. And I was saying, Steve says this, and Al Jazeera says this. And he got back to me pretty quickly, actually. His comms person, presumably during the press conference, got back to me and said, we're seeing these conflicting reports. We'll get back to you as soon as we can with our input. And their input was that the number was the same that they'd said, 20 minutes ago. It was one casualty. But reports did still roll in about deaths and from Iraqi troops, and they were citing government sources there. I can't verify that. I can only say that this is what they reported, and this is what Steve Warren says. And so that is kind of a little frustrating thing for me as well. You want to make sure that you've got the truth, but these things do get rather murky. You have to kind of just talk to somebody like Steve and say, well, the response is this. And so that's kind of that's a frustrating point. I'd love to be able to go somewhere and kind of verify myself, but good Lord, I have a wife and kids, and I just simply can't do that at a moment's notice. But that's sort of one of the things for capital T truth in the current conflict landscape that's going on.
So Eli, you mentioned basically the change in these Islamist groups, their ability to use social media, the internet, whatnot. But how about the flip side of that? So Americans, Westerners' experience or knowledge of these conflicts is more informed, or is at least informed differently today, because whether you have, a brother-in-law in the army who might be in one of these conflicts, or you're on Twitter following, developments in Crimea or Syria as they happen. How does this changed media environment kind of change Westerners' experience of conflict, for good or for bad?
Well, let's unpack that question. I mean, I think that for the most part, social media has this effect, and it was just perfectly kind of explained by Mr. Watson here, that you have, I think it keeps our government, which is bigger, but it keeps big organizations in some ways more honest. I mean, I can say, having covered the Benghazi story, that a lot of the best information that initially came out that this was a terrorist attack were coming from the kind of special operations, broader community, and their families and people who supported them, saying, I mean, what we're hearing on television does not match, and that's that dynamic, I think, in play. And I think we saw that in the Iraq War, that gone are the days where you can have what they used to call the Friday Follies in the briefings about Vietnam. And Vietnam actually sort of changes that, right? Because we have television on the front lines and you see these visceral images. But it's even more so today. And I actually think it actually raises an important strategic question, which is, what does this media environment mean for an advanced democracy like ours to wage long ground campaigns where you're going to have really bad news stories? They're going to exist in a much, in order to be successful in a counterinsurgency campaign, and Ryan can speak to this better than me, you're going to need years and years. So can the U.S. military wage such a campaign these days, knowing that it will be inevitable that you will get the viral video of some horrible atrocity that will have a huge political effect? And maybe it's a matter of just our culture kind of talking it out and adjusting its understandings, or maybe we just don't do counterinsurgencies anymore. But I do think it has a huge effect, and I think it means that a lot of the assumptions that we had, I think, in the beginning of the 9/11 era are no longer operable, given that a sustained kind of ground occupation, which we're in the middle of a situation now where clearly the strategy in Syria isn't working, but so few people, with the exception of Lindsey Graham, sort of Jeb Bush, are calling for these boots on the ground. And I think it's part of the reason is because we live in a media environment where down the road that will become a huge political problem.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that talk about our country's culture having a discussion about what we're facing here. And I think a lot of it's going to hinge on those bad news stories. Having been on the PR side of the military, those are devastating. But that's part of war. That's part of conflict. America has really kind of been fatigued by those 2 decades of thousands of American deaths. But we're looking at a pretty awful situation right now, and the discussion that you're referencing that we need to talk about, I feel like in the past month and a half alone, there has been kind of a rising tide of folks coming and writing commentary on Ryan's site and on Defense One about we're really going to have to kind of redefine national service. And a lot of what undergirds those arguments is this kind of like, it has the appearances of, because of so many nations involved, the appearance of World War III. And obviously that's just hyperbole.
Chris Christie said it last night.
There we go. See, that's the sort of thing that the nation, it kind of feels like we're on the brink of having this discussion, a very real and very sobering and very serious discussion. And we sort of have been in, 2 presidential terms of withdrawal. And these are kind of the hangovers that are going to linger on into the next 4 years, 2 years, probably, possibly even sooner. So I find that discussion point about having a conversation as a culture. Anytime there's a reasonable and smart way to do it, I definitely kind of get excited about those talks.
Well, I'll make 3 points. One is more directly answering what you were saying. a lot of this isn't new, this sort of, this hypermedia environment where, we talked about the CNN effect in the 90s, where the president is finding out at the same time as the rest of us. But that was still a rare event, is that you're like, we don't want CNN to cover this or this to happen. Now it's happening all the time. I remember when the airliner got shot down over Ukraine. I mean, we were watching and on Twitter, and you didn't have to have any special knowledge of who to follow. It was just coming up of like the Boot missile systems being moved out of Ukraine. But people were just tweeting photos of it live. And so the president finding out at the same time as you and me is now completely routine in many ways. And picking up Eli's point, I don't think it's media and the sort of grueling atrocities and terrible things inherent in these sort of long counterinsurgency campaigns. I think it actually has more to do with how our leaders sell these wars to us in the first place. And no one actually intends on getting into a counterinsurgency campaign. You just sort of find yourself into one incrementally. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what happened more recently in Afghanistan. That's obviously what happened in Iraq. And that's actually what might be happening in Iraq again, even though we're saying we're not going to do it. There are still more troops going into this country. And I think the next president, no matter who it is going to be more hawkish than this one. So I just think that has more to do with how we get involved in these places in the first place, and you'd think after all this time we would have learned those lessons, but we're terrible at learning lessons. And on what Ben said about having a serious conversation, I actually don't, I think on my site we're trying to have a serious conversation, and on yours, and I know Eli's doing great reporting, but I think that the nature of the presidential primary contest, especially on the Republican side, there's just so many outlandish things being said that's actually what's sucking up all the conversation in foreign policy debate, which is a shame, because it's almost like the last 15 years haven't happened, and we're just having this contest of who can say the craziest thing, and the media is rushing to cover it and making that the story and that the conversation. And I actually think that's really unfortunate and a failing of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. This isn't a partisan thing. This is just, they're making a lot of money off of it, so they're covering it.
Let me pose a hypothetical. Just going back 10, 11 years, Abu Ghraib. Now, this is a scandal that becomes a mega scandal because of cell phone photos of this subpar unit in Abu Ghraib that was, abusing and torturing Iraqi prisoners. And very few of those initial photographs actually make it out to the public. The story is broken by Cy Hirsch because he gets hold of a report by Takuba, who is evaluating the Iraqi prison system significantly after these events. And the government and the military not only knows about it, they have a handle on it. So it becomes a scandal by the time there's already a process in place for the military to address it. Imagine today, do you think if there was an Abu Ghraib today, if there was, let's just say, following the logic, a significant occupation, the U.S. is back in the detention business, and something like this happens, which is going to happen in wars, do you think the Pentagon would be able to get a handle on this before those photographs went out to the internet and everyone saw them?
No. In a word, no.
Right?
So what does that mean for the ability of the U.S. to conduct these kinds of operations? And maybe the answer is it just doesn't anymore.
It means play by the book.
What?
Don't follow the rules.
I agree.
Right?
I'm saying, but I think even if you do follow the rules, you're going to get stuff like this. Even if you do everything right, even if what?
Look at Kunduz, the Kunduz strike where that happened.
Yeah.
That was just an awful disaster, and there's allegations of Kurds torturing going on right now as well.
Right.
No, I agree. I just don't think it's actually that different, even if it's happening faster, because there's always embarrassing things that get leaked in Pentagon papers. There's always these embarrassing things, and I think whether it's something that prisoner abuses that had happened in the last week or it happened like 6 months ago and we're now getting reported ends up not making a huge difference in terms of how the scandal plays out.
Oh, I think
Maybe I'm wrong, but
I think the Abu Ghraib scandal had an enormous effect on the Iraq War.
I'm not saying it didn't have an effect. I'm just saying if it happened today and the story broke faster because someone sent the photos on WhatsApp to you or something,
Right.
I don't think that would have made it still would have made a huge difference, and not in a much different way than it actually played out.
I do think that there's a difference between the Pentagon realizing it's a problem, beginning the military justice process, and even sending out, the beginning process of trying to figure out what's going on by the time it becomes a massive international news story, or learning about the prison abuse at the same time the rest of the world is. I think there's a huge difference in that.
Yeah,
I think Rumsfeld handled it terribly in a lot of ways, you could say, even though he understood how grave the situation was. But I think there's just a huge difference there.
I think today that there's a lot of sort of muscle memory in crisis communications within the Pentagon and within the Defense Department that didn't exist at 2004. And I feel like it would be handled, and maybe I'm just projecting because I had been in the Army, but I feel like it would have been handled a little bit more smartly today. It still would have been pretty awful had something similar occurred, but I don't think that it would have been quite as devastating. And of course, that kind of feeds into the narrative that America is, doesn't like people that aren't from America. You got the abuse of Guantanamo and the symbolism and the recruiting symbolism of that. That kind of feeds into that. That dynamic plays out a little differently today because those things are sort of not really behind us, but at least they've been digested within the culture in a certain way.
But sort of bringing it back to what we were talking about just now, if you listen to Hillary or Ted Cruz or even Marco Rubio, they all pretty much say there should be more boots on the ground in Syria, but it should be Arabs, it should be our partners who are the majority of the boots on the ground. Now, I've spent some time with Arab militaries, and I'm pretty sure the reasoning for that is not because Arab militaries are better at counterinsurgency or better at special operations than our military. In fact, I mean, that's not the reason for it. The reason, I think, is this political reason, which is that in war there will inevitably be abuses, there will inevitably be scandals, and better for the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to handle that problem than us. And I don't know. I don't even know what I think about it. I'm just raising it as a kind of provocation here. I mean, I could argue it, I guess, both ways, but I think that's going to be the new reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a media-driven thing, though. I guess we see the causation a bit differently. I think we want Arab armies to do it so we don't have to do it, because it's more about the coffins coming back home and these inconclusive outcomes in these wars and these unsatisfying outcomes in these wars. And there's a lot of people that are cautious on both sides of the aisle of repeating that experience. So I'm not sure that's a media-driven issue.
Well, we're so I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but we're so, like, those of us who know what we're talking about, I'm not talking about the, commenters on the internet, but we're so committed to this concept of the long war. It's the one thing it's going to be a long, it's going to be a big slog. But I wonder if, are we already pre-baking in that we're going to have inconclusive outcomes, or that we never talk about, all right, what are the conditions of victory against, wider than the Islamic State, or the Al-Qaeda, but the global jihadist movement? What would it look like to win that war so we don't have to keep doing this? We seem to never talk about that. We always talk about it's going to be a long time, and we're going to need a lot of, partners and learning from our past mistakes and best practices and counterinsurgency, yada, yada.
Well, America can't go around, cleaning up everybody's backyard.
I agree. They shouldn't be going around doing that. But I'm just saying it's I don't know. Seems like a recipe for forever war.
You bring up a great point in the communications side. And I remember working on the debrief. Every time I'll see another Pentagon official say it's going to be a multi-generational struggle, the thought occurs to me, who's the one who said that last? How long ago? And every time I look, it was longer ago than I thought that an official had said, hey, guys, this one's going to take a long time, but it's going pretty swell right now. That's kind of the thing that we're going to be hearing, it looks like, for another while. Obama made his other stop at the Pentagon, this rare visit on Monday, and what was the result? It's going pretty swell. That's the sort of line that I expect to hear more and more. I would love to hear a broader explanation of what swell looks like, a year from now or whatever. But I assume it's discussions that are going on, behind closed doors, trying to get these people to say, hey, wake up, this is your backyard. And that's sort of what the Saudis did, 2 days ago with this 34-member Islamic coalition, in a way. And that's been one of, there's a lot of skepticism that will kind of go anywhere, because there's a lot of skepticism in the region, period. But it's a pretty significant step in my book, and I've got a brother in the National Guard who's been to Iraq a couple times and Afghanistan a couple times. And he always hits on the point about Saudi Arabia taking a big step, and consistently he's hit that point. So it's sort of been encouraging for me to hear that story after his points, saying these local nations need to do something about it. But the communications aspect and the element from the American side, it is pretty depressingly lacking, that's for sure.
Let me take this back to the idea of the national conversation about these wars, and tie it into kind of the new media environment. If we did this panel 5 or 10 years ago, it would probably be 3 people from, the Washington Post or the Times or CNN or Fox News, and Eli and Ben, you guys work for organizations that have pieces of traditional media but are also kind of very new in different ways. Ryan, your site is obviously, a new entrant. Nothing like it really existed 5 or 10 years ago. How does kind of some of the niche ability to do deeper dives, does that help this national conversation, or does the 15 seconds on Fox News, is that really what's driving the conversation? I guess my question is the new media environment, is there a potential there to actually have a more substantive national conversation, or are we all just going to be clicking on Facebook links that say you won't believe what happened next? I mean, is there a hope, I guess, for a more substantive conversation at a national level?
I'll just, I think there is, but I think you have to differentiate. So putting this in the context of what's happening in media. Oh, hey, Stephen. There's a tremendous market pressure for media companies to become content factories, where they're just putting out more and more and more and more stuff all the time, because that's the easiest and simplest way that a lot of companies see to make more money, because we're all hungry for content, we're all on our phones all the time, and so we can all be reading or watching or listening to something. And so the media industry is taking that in 2 different ways. On one hand, you have companies that are going for that, and on others you have companies that are focused on a more elite audience, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're never going to be as big as BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed's doing great work with their journalism, as Eli knows. And actually, I will say
my girlfriend is a BuzzFeed employee,
and they had one of the best foreign policy journalism stories of the year. I think I forget her name. That did the schools in the USAID schools in Afghanistan.
right?
Great story. But in terms of what BuzzFeed mostly does, it's mostly about mass media. And, we're trying to focus on a more elite audience and hold, almost a quarter of our readers are in the Washington metro area. So we are very much focused on what people that are involved in national security and defense and foreign policy are thinking and doing and how they're making their decisions. As far as the national conversation, there's just so much noise out there, from 24-hour cable news to proliferation of websites out there. So, and I think we're sort of discovering that maybe we don't want, as we're sort of with Trump's suggestion that we keep Muslims out of this country, and how enthusiastically that was actually received, frighteningly, by large portions of this country. Maybe we don't want that sort of everyone in America involved in the broader national conversation necessarily. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think at the national level, the answer is, it seems to me the answer is no, these things won't, really alter a great deal. Defense One, and War on the Rocks, we do. But we're not going to be changing the national dialogue. What we're going to be doing is informing the sort of specialists who might change the national dialogue 5-10 years from now. It's sort of a long view take. It seems to me sort of an investment in the our own intellectual future as a country. But like immediately, we're not going to be shifting those things. Defense One has a model that, if you asked about 5 to 10 years ago, there might have been something similar-ish in Danger Room from Wired. And then those guys, quite good. Noah and Spencer both went on to work, at the Daily Beast and The Guardian, respectively. They went on to bigger outlets, and Danger Room flounders or whatever. It was a different time then. It's a different time now. But there's so much information out there. I mean, I talk to folks who do the newsletters that I do, similar to, the debrief. I could spend 7 hours in the morning just digging up stories, because it's like, oh, this leads to this, and the flood of information that's out there can consume so much of our time. You know, you have to pick and choose, and that's why you need so many of these kind of just newsletters, just to pick those, to kind of round up all the events that are going on. It's dizzying, but those things, again, I think they support more for the dialogue in the future as opposed to today, because you're still going to get your dominant voices in your lead media outlets. And I think it'll sort of just stay that way for, I don't know, eternity maybe? Yeah.
I think it's generally a good thing to sort of have everything disaggregated. If you think about it in an earlier era where there were more newspapers and more people covering the stories, you get a lot of the same story from different people. And there was a lot of repetition. I think you probably get that today, but I think all of us, I mean, Bloomberg is certainly in a mainstream media outlet, and I was at Newsweek and the Daily Beast before. But having been at smaller outlets, over my career, the internet, it's a leveling effect. If you get a good story and, people will notice it, and you can, and if all you do is kind of blandly repeat what spokesmen at, the Pentagon say, and you work for the New York Times, you won't be having much of an impact. Whereas I think a generation ago, everybody wanted to be at the New York Times, even if your job was just to sort of take notes at the briefing. But overall, it's a good job. And in some ways, it really shrinks the space between journalists like myself who are trying to make sense of a detailed conversation for a broader audience, and then the analysts themselves who are trying to make sense of sort of what's happening, for a more specialized audience. But it shrinks that space. I mean, we're all kind of trying to figure out what's going on. And that's a good thing. I mean, so I read War on the Rocks and then Defense One every day, and it's good for driving how I think about what I'm doing. And in some ways, I don't really see, as a columnist now, I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't ever want a job in the government, but I think, we're all kind of trying to figure out how to do the same thing. And, I write a lot, and sometimes it gets a huge social media and internet push, and lots of people read it. And sometimes only a few people read it, and that doesn't necessarily correlate whether I think it was sometimes my best work is not as well read, and sometimes a quick thing that you do because it's right on the news cycle is goes viral.
And also, if something is not read very much, but if it's read by the right person in the right building, can have a huge impact. So.
I agree. Like I'm most happy when I feel like the most informed readers of mine like what I have to say, as opposed to when I get sort of the peanut gallery.
And that is what's great about Twitter. It actually doesn't drive as much traffic to media sites as people tend to think, but it's a great elite sort of influence barometer tool. There's this incredible instant feedback mechanism for the work that you're doing by a pretty large group of people, which is helpful in shaping how you then approach your future media strategy.
Let me ask one more question, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So be thinking of good things to stump these guys, put them on the receiving end of tough questions. I guess maybe this isn't a fair question, and feel free to push back, but for people like me, like those of us in the room who are on the analyst side or in think tanks, are trying to influence policy or influence what's going on in Washington, how should we think about interacting, particularly in the national security field, interacting with reporters, interacting with media? What would be your suggestions, particularly to younger folks or up and coming folks, how to think about it? What are your pro tips or whatever that might be for influencing the conversation in a helpful way?
Yeah, a couple of tips. Don't try to be the sort of jack of all trades. Get to know one or two subject matters better than anyone else, because then people will want to listen to what you have to say more than anyone else. When you're no offense to my journalist friends here, but when you get interviewed by a journalist for a story, it's much better to do it over email, because there's a big misquoting problem that can be very frustrating, in my opinion, rather than over the phone. And but then, of course, that leaves a trail if you're concerned about that sort of thing. And third is write for War on the Rocks. It's the best way to influence the national conversation.
I would disagree on the phone point, because I think you have to judge the journalist, right? So everybody's work is online, you can see it for yourself. But if you decide you want to go to a journalist, it's helpful to have a conversation sometimes to make sure that we understand what you're trying to say on that point. And I would also, I think you have to do what we all do, which is you have to sort of be on the news. So if you've just done an amazing report on the future of NATO, but everybody this week is talking about the Islamic State, then don't release your report on the future of NATO. Wait till Russia does some horrible thing in Ukraine, then release the report.
And also, don't just let a report drop.
Yeah, just don't be like, hey, everyone, we spent a year and a half looking at, Eastern European militaries in here. And that's actually very important. And that will have a huge impact on a news cycle at the right moment. It's just, if everybody's focused on the Middle East at that moment, and then no one's going to care, and then they're going to say, oh, 3 months ago there was some report. And, so you have to be very flexible about when you enter the debate like that.
Yeah, I was thinking timeliness, number one, which you illustrated quite well. Responsiveness, and even before you mentioned emails, I was thinking short emails. Keep your emails short. Somebody had tricked me with a short email, I think this morning. It was from some marketing firm, but it was similar to the way that I prefer an email be sent to me. It was super short, but by the time I realized what they were after, I was like, oh, darn, you got me to open it. But those are the ones that I get so many that are just way too wordy. Get your darn point a lot sooner. None of us have a whole lot of time, and we need to act fast. But to piggyback on Eli too, the face-to-face business is just that's just good human relations to me. But I definitely understand the point about, hey, that's not what I said. So
It's a lot more common than you'd expect. Never from these guys. I've never been quoted by these guys, but yet.
All right, let's open up for questions. Please just stand up, introduce yourself, and keep it to a question, not a speech, if you can. Sir.
My question is the following. Do you think that we can mitigate the risk of what happened and how, due to new media, which give access to sources on the ground, not necessarily professional journalists, and you have a system, it seems that the Israelis have been doing very thoroughly in this respect to collect as much diverse sources of information, and somebody should monitor it. But anyway, to make sure that we have access to spontaneous information, communication from a wider diversity of sources of information, including the public and so on.
your question is about finding maybe truth in these kind of reports that are not by professional journalists? Am I understanding that correctly?
To expand, and that should be monitored professionally.
Right.
Interpretation, and as I said, the only information I know of, more or less, is what Israel has been trying and isolated information
Sure.
to the show,
Sure.
and like what happened on the ground. So, is there any thinking, development, studies, how to use media, new technologies today, and also to win hearts and minds? I mean, we don't have any more army against army conflict. So, what is going on in Damascus versus Erbil and in Syria, Iraq? There are too many sources of information, wider diversity, and yet one information can steal the show and impose on the public opinion, political and others, decision.
I want to just kind of drill down on what you said about winning hearts and minds as a kind of. So first off, true journalist entities are not about winning hearts and minds. It's about trying to tell the truth of a particular situation as you know it. That said, every journalist has assumptions and biases, me included, everyone does. And particularly if you're good at it and you've been doing it for a long time, of course, you come at it from certain things. The difference between a journalist and someone else who sort of writes about things is that you are committed to a process that questions your assumptions. So if you think that, you know, my 4 pieces of information point to things being this way, you know, you try to say, all right, well, is there something I'm missing? Is there something that I'm assuming? Let's talk to the other side of that. Let's make sure that we get the full story. But you are never going to eliminate bias. Now, on to your point about winning hearts and minds. And I have been kind of thinking this for a while, but are we really worried about the vast majority of Muslims becoming walking smart bombs and joining this horrific, barbaric cult like the Islamic State? Or is this a phenomenon where it takes only a few, especially in Western societies, and that in another era they would have been anarchists, or another era they would have been, you know, part of the Baader-Meinhof group? And advanced societies are always going to have the problem of these kinds of fringes. And the issue is that these committed fanatic zealots in Syria have filled a vacuum where there was no state and there was no credible sort of civil society to sort of rebuff them, and then they accumulate power through horrific violence, which I think is the case. And if that is the case, is the best way to approach, from a government's perspective, to stop it, to constantly be worrying about this ever vulnerable group of law-abiding Muslims that could at any minute be turned because of rhetoric or something into being a supporter of the Islamic State? Or should we look at this in another way, which is to say, yeah, there's always going to be these kinds of radicals that are going to flood to this. It's a very, very small percentage. And, you know, in order to counter them, I guess my view is, why isn't there more of a kind of radical secularism or radical modernists? That I think what the Islamic State is doing right now, or what Al-Qaeda has done, is radicalizing in itself. It should have a counter effect. It's just a thought that I've had, because it seems that when we talk about this, we're acting as if at any given moment, you know, these people are going to be turned around and say, yeah, you know, maybe bin Laden is right. I don't think that's how it works. I think that, you know, people make decisions based on their own self-interest, and so they might say, listen, this is the strongest force. They have a much more modern, they're much more ferocious. I'd rather be their friend than their enemy. That happens all the time in the Middle East. But the notion that this is like an ideology that's going to, like, you know, sweep the world is nuts. It's only something that the delusional members of this cult believe, and apparently also high levels of the State Department. I don't know. It seems that way sometimes.
Any other question? Steve? There is actually a microphone, sir.
Steve Rodriguez. I work in venture capital, and I'm a contributor on War on the Rocks site. Picking up on, I think, 2 questions ago, where you guys were talking about the shifting news landscape since like the Times 10 years ago, and then now we have organizations like yours. What I found interesting about War on the Rocks is it's really kind of an elite network and an elite, I guess, set of analysts kind of commenting on stuff they actually know about, and in many cases have lived personally. Given the way the news landscape is moving in terms of your own organizations, do you see more models like War on the Rocks either popping up or indeed fusing with larger kind of enterprise organizations like Defense One or even Bloomberg? Or do you see them kind of splintering apart again, where you just get kind of everyone's kind of name brand, you know, Crowdhammer or George Will kind of pontificating on anything and everything? What models do you see kind of going forward? Thanks.
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, keep in mind, Krauthammer and Will, or you know, Krugman, I mean, in some ways they sort of are representing an ideological movement. And a nice thing about ideology, or I don't know if conservatism is ideology, it's a political kind of persuasion, is that it can give you a framework for understanding lots and lots of different issues. And that's been a part of our political debate and a good thing. What War on the Rocks is, are specialists who really know about this and are kind of interested with arguing each other in that narrow band. But it, as I said, I think it can be extremely influential for the rest of us who are kind of one or two steps removed from that, but still want to cover that world and understand what those debates are. So I think that both sorts of things will exist.
Yeah, I mean, I've already, since doing the debrief newsletter, there's already been, I think, 2 competitors, sort of competitors, kind of, that have folded. One of them launched and folded pretty quickly. I guess I shouldn't name names, but nevertheless, that sort of has occurred. You know, we would get emails from these folks, hey, great project, we're excited about this thing, this content, and then it drops right off. And so I sort of expect, I don't expect too many Defense Ones to kind of pop up. I think a lot of organizations sort of realize that they may have a kind of a toe in some of these topics already, and they'll kind of use that, especially as budgets start to shrink as well. And maybe some of these ambitious projects won't be quite as ambitious as time kind of wears on. But I was a little disheartened to see some of those those 2 outlets fold, and sources for pretty good, clever, funny, and also smart commentary. But it just means, hey, back to the standard 9 to 5 topics that we're all used to and have been for decades. For me anyway, I just don't see a whole lot of innovation that lasts or sticks going forward. Now that we have ISIS, before when Defense One launched, we had the end of 2 wars, right? The quote unquote end of 2 wars. And what's going to happen next for America? We've got all these veterans. What are they going to do? Well, that narrative changed in like a year. And so the entire emphasis, and now we've got all the Pentagon leaders saying Russia is the #1 problem. That was not the situation when Defense One launched, but it's been good for business. All the people, all my friends and family and stuff are a lot more informed than they ever were before. And timing, a lot of it was about timing. I'm just, I'm a pessimistic person naturally, so I'm not inclined to think that trend and the conditions that gave rise to Defense One will continue in the next 5 years.
I mean, obviously, I think War on the Rocks is fantastic, but I'll just to step back from my project a bit and what John Amble and I are doing with War on the Rocks. I do think this is a really exciting time in media where major media companies have figured out how to make money again in the internet age. I think there was a big lag where traditional media organizations didn't quite, and I'm not talking about cable news, but sort of print and online, were not sure how to adapt to the new media environment, which was sort of ironic because they were in many ways at the forefront of it. But I think that they've figured out the business models, and we're starting to see a lot of acquisitions that support that, Business Insider being the latest and biggest. So I think it's a really exciting time for publications like Defense One or War on the Rocks, even though we launched under very different circumstances, but to thrive. And not just in defense, but I think it's something that we're going to see a lot more like credible niche outlets coming out over the next few years.
I know there are other. Well, we'll maybe do one more question, Dave, in the back, and then call it a day. Well, in the back. Sorry, one behind you. Sorry.
There's kind of like this sort of clickbait type model where you have a large audience and then a much more elite audience. But sure, the larger media market may have figured out some way of monetizing their products. I'm not convinced that they have yet. But if you're like a site like yours, which has got a very, very, very good network of people who write for it and a very good audience, but it's a small audience, how do you make money off something like that? And how do you adapt your model so that more people maybe read it, or how do you get advertising or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very specific revenue plan, but I'd probably rather not discuss it in this public forum. But it's, you work at the National Interest. Full disclosure, I used to work at the Center for the National Interest, which owns the National Interest, although we never overlapped. But a lot of publications in this field are owned by nonprofits, foreign affairs, the National Interest. And so you see very different incentives shaping those organizations. And I'll just leave it at that. But there are definitely ways to monetize it. You just have to make investments in the area of the business that generate revenue.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, I would encourage you all to follow these gentlemen on Twitter, on any other social media platforms they may or may not be on. And please just join me in thanking them for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you for having us.